Welcome everybody to Humanities 2, Humanities 221. My name is David Granger, as you might have guessed. I've been at Geneseo for, I think, 21 years now, and have been teaching humanities probably for about the last 10 years, so I've done it quite a few times. And what I wanted to do today in this brief sort of lecture, it's kind of more an information session, is to talk about the syllabus, go over it with you, tell you how the class is going to be run, and make sure that you'll be ready to go with the readings that we'll be doing over the course of the semester, and kind of what the process is going to be, how the class is going to be run. So that'll be the plan for today. Always know that when you have questions, you can send me an email. I'm more than happy to respond to email. If you want to meet and talk about something in a little more depth, or you want to do something face-to-face, let me know that as well. And we can easily set up a Zoom meeting. I will be working from home the vast majority of the time over the semester, especially the early part of the semester. So it's easy to schedule meetings and to respond to email in a really timely way. So please don't feel like you're kind of left hanging out in left field and don't have the feedback that you'd like to have, don't have your questions answered, because I'm certainly willing to do that on a very regular basis. So again, anytime you have questions, things you want to talk about, just please let me know and we can easily do that. So I'm going to share the syllabus with you, as I said, and we'll go over it together. I'm not going to go over it in complete depth. I'd suggest taking some time over the next few days to look over it yourself. As I believe I did mention in an announcement that I sent out this past weekend, that the syllabus is under files in Canvas. It's not under the syllabus tab. So if you can't find it, that's probably why. There are a few other independent files that you'll find in the under files in Canvas. Most of the things are course readings, and those are in folders. But the syllabus is just its own file with the file name that includes syllabus. So again, please look there to find the syllabus and not under the syllabus tab. So the class is online, asynchronous, as you probably know. I'm generally running the class on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday basis, just because that's easiest to do kind of organizationally rather than just have things go by week, week by week in terms of what's due. I know that gets a little confusing. You don't know how to plan out your week, what to do first, et cetera. So I think if you basically follow the Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule that I have in the syllabus, especially for completing the readings, you'll find that it's easier to kind of keep up with class. And again, you'll feel like you're really connected with what's going on and not sort of, as I said before, kind of hanging out in left field by yourself. If you need to contact me, by far the best way to do it is by my email address. My office phone, I don't even really have an opportunity to answer because I'm not on campus, except maybe once every 3 months or something like that, at least recently. So please use my Granger Geneseo email address when you need to contact me. And again, if we need to meet about something, we can certainly do that. I think you probably have seen this sort of COVID statement at the beginning of some of your other syllabi. So the key here is being flexible, taking care of your health. If you are having issues, health issues, physically or mentally, please let me know. And I'll do what I can to try and accommodate so that it has a minimal impact on your coursework. And if you're able to be, flexible with me, I can certainly be flexible with you. That's the plan. Seemed to work pretty well last semester. Last semester, out of about 40 students, and I have about that same number this semester, I just had 1 or 2 students who needed to take incompletes to finish things up, which they did about within a month after the semester ended, so just recently. So I think that flexibility will work. Try to keep up to to date with things. If you do fall behind, let me know. I am concerned if I don't see that students have been logging onto Canvas and turning in their coursework. I become concerned about what's going on. So please try and let me know if you're having any issues. And hopefully, those of you who took classes in the fall were able to adjust a little bit to the online format. So right under that, I have the Geneseo writing guide. You will be writing 3 kind of medium-sized papers for this class. By medium-sized, I mean 3 to 4 pages. So some of you might be considered short rather than medium-sized. Plus 2 exams, and those are essay exams. So you'll be doing a decent amount of writing over the course of the semester. So I do recommend the writing guide. You'll also find under files and Canvas, the brief writing guide that I believed I mentioned in a different communication announcement over the weekend that I would recommend just for proofreading your work because it does include a list of things that students sometimes struggle with in terms of their writing. Some reminders. So again, you might find that helpful for proofreading. It's very brief. It's easier to find things in there than if you have a big writing guide to kind of page through or find your way through. So you might find that that is helpful, and I did update it very recently, as you know from that previous announcement. So this is just sort of standard for the humanities, certainly Humanities 1 and Humanities 2 in terms of introducing the class. We're reading some of the classics in Western thought, certainly not all of them. And these do tend to focus on the sort of dead white Western male kind of tradition that you see in Western humanities. However, I am including some additional readings, some more up-to-date readings, and certainly with our discussion, we will be talking about issues of contemporary importance relative to race, gender, etc., right? The kind of issues that were not addressed, certainly not through a kind of a critical lens in the traditional Western humanities texts. So we'll try and bring in some of those questions and issues as we do our reading. As it says here, we'll be looking at ethical issues and moral issues, the questions about choice and freedom, different kind of political and I should say political economic theories. We'll be looking at the impact of, in particular, World War I and World War II on Western humanities. We'll be looking at changes taking place as the map of Europe was being redrawn and sort of solidified a little bit as a result of World War I and World War II. So those are the kind of things we'll be sort of looking at over the course of the semester. And I should say too, quite a bit about human nature and the way human nature is viewed in the different texts. The learning outcomes are pretty standard here. I won't read through these. You can look over them yourself. You'll see that they relate to some of the issues that I just talked about a little bit in terms of what we'll be covering in the class. I tried to pick readings that are sort of naturally linked together. Sometimes that's because of one of the authors that we read influencing the next author that we read. Sometimes they're related in some way. Certainly they're related thematically if the authors aren't related, which is the case at some points. Teacher and student writings. That I think it helps with students and kind of finding the threads of the course, the main themes, being able to trace them throughout the semester, being able to trace them historically in sort of a timeline. And I will, in discussing the readings and also in discussion questions that I'll have for you to answer and to address what those ties and what those linkages and themes are as well, so you can follow those. I have an accommodations statement on here. I'm certainly more than happy to make accommodations for you. Please let me know of any accommodations that you have so that those can be addressed. If you haven't already talked to the Accessibility Services Office and need to for something, please go ahead and do that because then through that office, you can then let me know of any accommodations that you might have. In terms of due dates and due times for things, the days that things are going to be due, they're going to be due at the end of the day in terms of papers and discussion questions. The end of the day, 11:59 p.m. on the day that's listed on the syllabus. For discussion questions, for exams, you'll have all day to complete those. So I think you'll find that those of you who need extra time for things, that shouldn't be a problem with this class. If it is a problem or does become a problem, as always, please let me know so we can address that. Class expectations and requirements. One of the things that we stress in Humanities Agenda CO is reading primary sources rather than reading what somebody said about Aristotle or Plato or Locke or whoever it might be. We look directly at those texts first. Sometimes we will bring in some secondary, sources, secondary literature, but we really will focus on what the authors themselves have to say first. So you have the opportunity to read those authors for yourself before you might be influenced by what any secondary sources have to say. The only secondary source that we have as a standard for the course is very general. It's Marvin Perry's Western Civilization, Brief History, Volume 2. It's the 11th edition. If you do have an earlier edition, either probably the 9th or 10th edition might also work. The chapters might not align exactly, but the material, you should find the same, basic things in either volume 9 or volume 10, even though you might find that the chapters are off a little bit. That shouldn't be a big problem. If you can get volume 11, obviously that's the one that is the, excuse me, volume 2, the 11th edition, I should say. That's the one that's preferred. So it's volume 2, 11th edition. Volume 1 is the book we use for Humanities 1. It covers basically up through Shakespeare, and volume 2 picks up right after that. And it's either the second or third chapter of volume 2 that gets into what we'll be reading in terms of our original readings. First Locke, second treatise on government, and that volume 2. Along with the Perry reading, and you'll see that that's listed in the assignments in the syllabus. There are also PowerPoints that go along with each of the chapters that I would just like you to review. There are some photographs, drawings, pictures in those PowerPoints, but there are also some traditional PowerPoint slides that have some bullet points of things that are important from the chapters. So, please remember to look through those. Those are also listed on the syllabus. The PowerPoint that I have for this semester is actually a brand new one that goes with this 11th edition. So again, if you have a previous edition, the time frame might just be slightly off in terms of the PowerPoints as well as in terms of the chapters in the Perry book, but I don't think that'll cause a major problem. Obviously, lots of discussion in this class is what we usually do. We can't do that the way the class is set up, especially having it be asynchronous. However, I'm still using discussion questions that I usually have students do in small group work that we will be using over the course of the semester. Rather than having you assigned to a discussion group that you'll meet in class to discuss the questions with together, I am going to still be assigning you to discussion groups. And what you'll be doing is answering the questions for your particular group and then uploading those to Canvas. And you'll see when I publish those assignments how that's supposed to work. And then what will happen with that is then we will have 7 or 8 people who will be doing each of the 4 or 5, sometimes 6 sets of discussion questions. You'll upload those to Canvas for whichever questions are for your particular group. Then I'll read through them. I'll put together sort of a composite response to those questions based on the student responses. and I'll add some annotations, some corrections of my own, some things maybe that I want to highlight, etc. And then I will make those available to you again. I'll probably share those as I've done in the past, share those through a Canvas announcement with an attachment that will have in it all of the responses to all the questions. So even though you're not going to be in class to hear responses to all the questions from your peers and are only being asked to respond to the questions set for your particular group, you will have all the responses and you'll have my feedback on all the responses. So that I think is important to know. In terms of exams, the format for the exam will be essay. The material on the exams will be taken from my lectures and from the discussion question and responses. That's it. I'm not going to ask you to be familiar with, to be able to speak in depth about anything other that is what is in my lectures and in those discussion question responses. And frequently you'll see considerable overlap as well between my lectures and the discussion question responses, which I think you'll find helpful, to hear me both talk about some of the things that you have some notes on at the same time. As it also says here in the syllabus, we'll be both asking, what's the significance of the things we're talking about? What was the significance at that time period? That's really important to put everything within its own historical framework. And then to also think about how is it valuable today? How are some of these writings, some of these issues that authors are discussing still impacting us today? And I think you'll find that there's probably more significance, more impact than you might recognize or assume before taking the course. There really is quite a bit in going back, even in HUM 1 and going back to Plato and Aristotle, there's a lot. But certainly if we go back to Locke's treatise and second treatise on government, which we'll start as our first reading for this class, you'll see how the questions raised in that about politics and forms of government are still questions that we're asking today. With the sort of challenges we've had in our elections, the last couple, especially presidential elections, you will see some of the issues and questions discussed by Locke directly relevant to things we're talking about today in terms of the government, in terms of elections. As we get into some things subsequent to the Locke reading, we'll talk a little bit about things like the Electoral College. Where did that come from? What does it do, et cetera? So I will try to emphasize the contemporary relevance to the things we're talking about, even though they might go back, several hundred years. I really want to encourage you, as well as reading the chapters of the books that were assigned or the page numbers I have listed in the syllabus, to also read any study guides, introductions that you would like to. There you'll find in the folders in Canvas that there are some additional discussion questions that you're not assigned to respond to. The ones you're assigned to respond to will appear in the assignments as they publish them. There are additional questions you might just want to look over. They're kind of thought-provoking. There's some biographical sketches of the authors that I'll actually be going over in my lectures. So if you're interested in those or want to look at those for the purposes of a paper or something, please open the folders for the readings, check out what additional information is there. The books themselves will have introductions, sometimes an editor's note, etc. Editor's note can be helpful. I would definitely encourage you to read the introductions, at least the first part of them, if they're very lengthy, because I think you'll find those helpful as well. So editor introductions or just author introductions that are actually in the books themselves, please try to read at least some of those. And if you think you would find it helpful, open the folder in Canvas for the particular readings. You'll find some additional study guides, biographies, additional discussion questions, etc. Especially when it comes to writing your papers and you want some additional information, some additional issues to think about. You might find those in these folders on Canvas for the readings. Grading policy, see essays are 30%, and there are 3 essays, so essentially each of those is 10%. Midterm exam is 20%, along with the final, which is 30%. Final will be a little lengthier. Then the discussion questions you'll be doing at a pretty regular basis. Almost all the readings will have at least one set of discussion questions you'll have due for that. The lengthier readings might have 2 sets of discussion questions, but that's how the grading policy will be. Descriptions of assignments. So the discussion questions, as I talk about here, and again, please take some time on your own to look over the syllabus and read in more detail. But again, I usually use those for small group purposes. I'm not doing that this semester. You will be assigned to a group and you will answer those particular discussion questions. I'll give you all the student responses to those, but we're not be doing any kind of group activity, either synchronous or asynchronous group activity. Certainly, I encourage you, if you know somebody you'll be spending time with who's taking this class in the same section, and you want to discuss the questions with that person, prepare for exams with that person, work on writing papers in terms of getting feedback from a peer, certainly you're free to do that. But there's nothing in the way the course is formally set up that will have us doing group meetings. But again, if you would like to do that, you know, I certainly think that you could find that helpful. The discussion questions, just like the exam topics, you'll find that those involve both informational questions, so asking you about something, or knowledge questions, you might call them, to make sure you understand something, as well as opinion questions. You'll always have time to talk about what your own views are, if you agree or disagree with the author, you know, that sort of thing. And as I mentioned here in bold type, I'll be giving you back the response to the discussion questions with my annotations, as well as these weekly lectures. And I'll be addressing those discussion questions as well in my weekly lectures, some in more detail than others. It depends on how much other material there is that's not in the discussion questions that I want to talk about in the lectures. But typically, you know, it helps to reinforce things. I think you'll find for the exams, the midterm and the final, that the essay topics for those exams will deal with issues that I stress multiple times. The exams won't be asking about things I just mentioned just once or just briefly. You know, it'll be things that are, you know, major themes that we're talking about over the course of the semester. And again, this is a lot of material for the class. I know some of you are probably really intimidated by it. But I think you'll find that you have a pretty good sense of what I want you to know based on the discussion questions and based on my lectures. Again, there are 3 papers, 3 to 4 pages each. Traditional, you know, double space, 12-point font. You'll upload those to Canvas when I make the assignment available to you. I'll make the assignment available for the theme-oriented papers well in advance, at least a week in advance. If you want to look even a little more advanced than that, you will find in Canvas the topics you have to choose from for each of the 3 papers. If you want to go ahead and, you know, get in sort of an advanced look at those, you'll find that those are there. They'll also be in the Canvas assignments as I publish those. You do need to have a references, works cited, or bibliography page. That depends on the citation style that you use for all papers. Based on what you're comfortable with, what you're familiar with in your major, you can use APA, MLA, or Chicago style for your citations. I'd like you to cite both direct quotations and paraphrases, close paraphrases of material. I mentioned the Hackett Writer's Reference just because it's used in a lot of humanities sections. If you have a copy of that, you can use that. Also, the link on the front of the syllabus to our writing guide, plus the brief writing guide that I put in Canvas under files. So all of that material is there. You'll see that for the 3rd thematic paper, you also asked to include an outside resource of some kind. It can be a relevant work of fiction or nonfiction. Just something that's outside of the material you're assigned for class. that you want to incorporate into your third paper. It can help you to answer one of the questions in your paper. It can provide additional information, scholarly backup for an argument you want to make in your paper, any of those kind of things. All 3 papers, like the discussion questions, will be submitted through Canvas. And then I will go through those and make sure that you know what your grade is and that I received those. Exam format, they'll be all essay. Again, they will address themes that are themes that we talk about at multiple times over the course of the semester, that are major themes, both in discussion questions and in the lectures. And just as with the discussion questions, the essays will essentially have 2 parts: more information or knowledge-oriented part, and the more opinion-based part. It's fine to use first person in your papers or in your exams. I guess I'm from the generation of people who believe, and sort of were taught to believe, that the idea that you can certainly write from a completely objective standpoint is faulty. It's impossible to do. You're necessarily writing through the lens of your own person, your own experiences. And rather than pretending that you're writing being completely objective, I would rather have you, write in the first person. If you don't want to, that's fine. Sometimes those of you in the sciences, might not be comfortable with that. That's all right. But certainly it's fine to write in the first person. And as long as in your writing, it's clear, where you're just giving an opinion and where you are, trying to report on what, one of the authors says. But it's more important, I think, to be upfront about the fact that you are writing as a particular person, living in a particular time and place, et cetera. And you can still try and be objective in doing that, rather than, not using first person. But again, I'll leave that as a choice for you based on what you're comfortable with. Here's the general grading criteria for papers. You might want to look that over. So here are the required texts, and you either need to rent copies of these, borrow them, purchase them, whatever. There might be used copies of these floating around too, because I know a lot of humanities instructors use similar texts. I try to keep them fairly up to date, because what happens is the bookstore has a difficulty finding back editions once the new edition has been out for a while. If there are multiple editions that will work for the class for a particular reading, I'll let you know. Or if you have a question, if you saw online an earlier edition of something and it's a lot cheaper and you want to know if it will work, just let me know and I can tell you whether or not it will work for the class. You can also, obviously, do this in terms of getting e-copies of books, whatever will allow you to have the readings and to be able to have those completed for class. So some of these names are going to be familiar with you. John Locke, as I mentioned, we'll start off with the Second Treatise of Government. Mary Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, is the first real major, complete, relatively thorough text talking about the rights of women. And Wollstonecraft was writing sort of at the back part of the Enlightenment, which we'll talk about during the semester. That is when empiricism started to replace the authority of tradition and religion in people's views about lots of things, including people's views about women and society and government and politics. So Wollstonecraft is writing in that tradition. She's not writing in a real modern feminist tradition, you'll note, but her writings were certainly forward-thinking, and many people would have taken them to be radical at the time they were published in 1792. Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. I like to teach that quite a bit. 1848, which was actually a year there were lots of revolutions going on in Europe. It was known as the Year of Revolutions. People refer to communism a lot and sometimes to Marx and Engels a lot without having read what they actually said. I think you'll find it's enlightening and interesting to read what they actually said. In particular, you will see how they are trying to create what they believe is actually a more democratic form of social arrangements and economic arrangements and political arrangements in society. They kind of look at all those things together. You'll probably see that some of the critiques that they offer of capitalism are critiques that are still raise or deal with issues and questions that we raise today about what happens when a very few people get a lot of power in society. What does that mean for political arrangements? What does that mean for social arrangements? What does that mean for education, et cetera? And I'll try and highlight those things because, you know, I think many people today who would not consider them communists by any stretch would agree that some of the issues of Marx and Engels bring up in the Communist Manifesto, which are challenges that we face with capitalism, are indeed things that we're trying to address and still trying to address in this country and in other capitalist nations as well. So give the reading a chance. You know, you certainly might not agree with their alternative to capitalism, but read the points of critique they make, try and identify with and understand what they're trying to do. Try and put yourself in the historical time and place in which they're writing, right? As the Industrial Revolution is really getting, you know, sped up, and you have women and children working in unsafe conditions in factories. There's no 40-hour work week. You have to work as long as you're told you have to work to keep your job. The same thing is true of men in households, dangerous work conditions, really horrible pay. And if you threatened to go on strike because you wanted more pay, certainly in this country, they would just take the next boat of immigrants coming into the country and put them in that position because workers are being de-skilled. Put yourself in that position of the historical time and place. So give the reading a chance. I think you'll find that there's a lot of value in reading it. I think you'll find when you hear or are involved in discussions in politics during elections, for example, that it provided you with some insights and some knowledge that you didn't previously have that you might find interesting, helpful, etc. I had multiple students tell me that of all the things they read in the class, that the Communist Manifesto was the book that they came away with, even though still disagreeing with communism, having learned the most that they can apply to their thinking about their politics and how they vote and political issues, socioeconomic questions, political questions about arrangements, policies, laws, and society, etc. Sigmund Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, one of his classic texts, we'll also read. Charlotte Perkins Gilman is a little more modern, 1892, of writing in the feminist tradition. It definitely has a little more modern feel to it than the Wollstonecraft reading. It's over 100 years after. So you would hope that you would actually exactly 100 years after. So you would think that would be the case. Some of you may have read it before. It's just a short story. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. There's a lot going on in that that's interesting from lots of different perspectives, culturally, socially, philosophically. It's a great story as well. One of my favorite all-time books, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, we'll be reading. It's often considered the first psychological thriller, puts you in the head of a main character who it asks you to sort of identify with and be somewhat sympathetic with, who is also an ex-murderer. So very interesting. 1866, very interesting time, also in Russia. Voltaire's Candide, which has a lot of real biting kind of humor. Voltaire uses lots of sarcasm, etc. He's critiquing European and especially French society of his day, and doing it in a way that's very sort of comical with real biting sarcasm. Some of you might be aware of the musical based on Voltaire's Candide that Leonard Bernstein wrote the music for. Very entertaining reading as well. And then as our more contemporary reading, we have Elie Wiesel's Night Trilogy. Some of you may have read Night before. I know students in New York State sometimes read that for school. There are two other sort of short stories that go along with night called Dawn and Day. I'm going to have you read those as well as night, because I think you'll find those are really, they help you to learn more about Elie Wiesel, the challenges of his attempts to move on with his life after having survived the Holocaust, trying to have relationships, trying to develop a career, just trying to live in the world as a Holocaust survivor. So we'll actually read all 3 parts of that Night trilogy. That's why I'm asking you to buy the trilogy and not just Night by itself, because we'll be reading Night, Dawn, and Day. This is the Perry text that I mentioned previously, 11th edition, but again, if you have one that's maybe the 9th or 10th, that should still work. The only of the text that you will find in Canvas under files and in HUM1, I can make a lot of things available free for students because they are historical documents. We're working with more contemporary writings that still have, we still need to not be sharing those and photocopying those, et cetera. So you have to buy those texts or borrow them, et cetera. But the American history documents are freely available. So I have put those in Canvas in a file that says American history documents. We'll do in the Declaration, the Constitution, Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, which some of you might remember from history class or social studies, were written around the time of the Constitution in terms of debates about what form the Constitution should take, in particular, how strong a central government should we have in this nation. We'll be reading Frederick Douglass's 5th of July speech, which he was actually asked to deliver on the 4th of July. Before he was invited to give this address at a women's sewing society, a great sort of crucible of progressive and radical thinking on the part of women, political and economic and social, often having to do with women's rights in terms of the right to vote and to have jobs outside the home, those kind of things, took place during these sewing society meetings, because women were together with themselves, together. The men weren't there, and they had a chance to talk about these issues that they otherwise wouldn't have had a chance to talk about, because many of them, their husbands wouldn't want to talk, with them about these kinds of issues. They wouldn't think it's appropriate, or, the women were capable of discussing these issues. So these sewing societies are really important historically. And the Sewing Society invited Frederick Douglass to give this 5th of July speech. We'll also be reading a piece by Harriet Martineau called The Political Non-Existence of Women. Each of the things we're reading about women's rights and freedoms looks at things from a little more of a modern, historical perspective. We'll also be reading the Iroquois Constitution as it's purported to exist. It's not clear how much the copy of it that we have, the version of it that we have available today, is like the original version, since originally we know a lot of these things were, they're part of oral cultures. These things were not written documents, and you don't know who wrote them, what the circumstances were, if they were dictated to somebody, how influenced they are by Europeans who were copying them over or adapting or changing them, et cetera. So lots of debate and controversy about, the authenticity of the Iroquois Constitution. Nonetheless, it does raise some interesting issues, especially vis-a-vis the Constitution in this country that we'll be talking about. Okay, assignment list here. All my lectures will be posted in Canvas on Canvas pages. I'll be sending you emails as announcements as soon as they're posted, and there'll be a link right in the Canvas page. The Canvas page should be titled with the name of the lecture or the author for that lecture, so you can find those handily. I'll also be posting this particular syllabus lecture there. And then you'll see how the writings proceed. We'll be doing 3 days on Locke's second treatise. Tells you what chapters to have read. The readings are due the day they are listed here. So for Wednesday, you will have chapters 1 through 6 to prepare. I will be posting a lecture. You'll also see that, right, on Wednesday or thereabouts, that will cover up through chapter 6 of the Locke reading. Chapter 9 is the reading in the Perry text that corresponds historically generally with the kind of it's a little earlier, but generally with the framework we're reading about. So I ask you to have that read, you'll see, by February 8th, and to also review the PowerPoint that you'll find in Canvas by February 8th. So you'll have a little bit of time to have that, finished. Then for Friday's class, have read up through chapter 13. I will previously assign you your discussion groups so you'll know what questions to answer. I'll do that in the next couple days. The discussion questions are due. I'll publish that assignment here briefly. And again, send you your discussion group number. You'll find the discussion questions link right there with the assignment. Open it up, respond to your particular questions. About a paragraph of a response to your question set is fine. Then upload that to Canvas. And again, then I will pull everybody's responses together and post for you those responses with my annotations. So obviously the bold type here is basically when things other than the readings are due. Then we're moving on to Voltaire. Let's see, we've got a couple of lectures also for Voltaire here. Let's say 1 lecture, 2 lectures for Locke, 2 lectures of Voltaire, set of discussion questions for each. We move ahead on February 10th, assigning chapter 10 of the Perry book, which needs to be done on the 15th, along with the PowerPoint. So again, you'll be able to know when those things are going to be due. The Perry book, you'll find helpful both in answering the discussion questions at points, especially when the readings start to really align closely historically with the readings we're doing. So the chapter in the Perry book will be the same period of time as the reading we're doing. And also for your papers, you can always feel free to incorporate information about what's going on culturally at the time of the reading, information about the author that's in the Perry book. So I think again, please read those. You'll find those helpful. Next, we move on to the U.S. history documents. Those are already available to you in Canvas in a file folder. Then the Wollstonecraft reading, and you can see that I put this together historically. And again, there'll be links between all the readings that I'll emphasize. Quite a few days on a Vindication. It's rather lengthy. Shelley's Frankenstein, which some of you might find it's usually Voltaire students usually find that really interesting because it's political philosophy was written in the form of a story. It's very entertaining. Shelley is also, there's a lot of politics and science and philosophy in it, but it's an entertaining story. Marx and Engels, it's a relatively brief reading. I think it's relatively readable, you'll find. And again, students often find that interesting because they've heard a lot about it or about communism, but have never taken the time or had the opportunity to get their own firsthand reading. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is, again, one of my favorite texts. I'm actually currently reading Tolstoy's War and Peace for the first time, all 1,500 pages or whatever it is. They're the two great novelists in Russia from this time period. And maybe the greatest novelist ever from Russia. And some people would say greatest novelist ever, period. Dostoevsky writes, again, puts you inside the head of the characters. It's very psychological. You see the train of thought of the characters. You'll see their confusion when they're being impacted by, especially the main character, by tiredness or alcoholism or mental problems that he has. You're in the main character's head through all of this, right? So it really is kind of a psychological thriller sort of thing. And there's a murder shortly into the book. And basically the book is the process of unraveling the specifics about this murder. Really interesting book. It's lengthy. I'm hoping my enthusiasm in the lectures will help you with that aspect. Freud's Civilization Has Discontents. You already know a lot of the vocabulary of Freud because it's part of popular vocabulary, the id, the ego, Freudian slips, all those kinds of things. My initial lecture here will go over a lot of the terminology that Freud uses. This book deals with primarily with the issue of sexuality and how civilization is to help us deal with sexuality. Freud says sexuality is one of the drives that comes from the id, which is our basic biological drives The id wants those drives to be satiated immediately. Obviously, we can't do that sexually. So we have civilization, we have society, we have policies and laws and morals and things on how we deal with our sexuality. And we need to have that, but at the same time, it is the source of our discontent here. So it's interesting. Civilization is a necessity, but it's a necessity that in and of itself can cause us all kinds of psychological traumas and how we deal with blockages or things that deny us from directly fulfilling the needs of the impulses of our id. Elie Wiesel's Night Trilogy, we'll start with night, and then we'll read Dawn and Day, about Elie Wiesel's experience during the Holocaust. Bold, you'll see when the papers are due. I will publish those again ahead of time. And I will also give you ahead of time some information on the exams, so you'll know what to expect for the exams, how to prepare for those. You can also find more information farther up the syllabus under exams in terms of the format. Those will be due at the end of the day, on the day things are listed to be due, so 11:59 p.m. The same thing of the 2 exams. I hope you found that helpful. Make sure you have the books ready to go ahead of time before they're due. Some of you might not be, I know many students won't be purchasing or renting all of them at the same time. You know, that's fine. But just make sure you have them ready to go on the day that we'll be using them. Again, we'll be starting out with John Locke's Second Treatise of Government and Voltaire, Wollstonecraft, and again, those US history documents, which you don't need to access or purchase yourself. Those are in a file folder in Canvas. So again, I hope you found that helpful. First up, we'll have the Locke reading. Again, take some time to read over the syllabus yourself. If you have any questions, please let me know so I can address those for you. There's a good chance if you have a question about something, you have classmates who do as well, and that will help me to know that. And so I can, you know, answer everybody, give everybody a response to that question if it's something I think people might be confused about. I will see you again when I post my first lecture. And again, email me anytime you need to.